Hello and welcome to my YouTube channel once again. Today we have the case of Sandra Cantu. Up there, on the one that's on screen, you can see the rest of my cases. My social media links are below if you'd like to follow me on any platform. And without anything else to say, let's get started. Sandra Renee Cantu was born on March 8, 2001 in the city of Tracy, one of the most popular cities in San Joaquin County in California, United States. She was the fourth and last child of the marriage between Maria Chavez and Daniel Cantu, who divorced shortly after the little girl's birth. Maria was the one who obtained custody of her children, so she moved with them to her parents' house, located in the Orchard States Mobile Home Park in the same city of Tracy. And here we are going to pause for a moment to explain what this place was like, as it will be important later on to understand the context of the events. Basically, Sandra and her family lived in a private mobile home park. To clarify, these are not just typical mobile homes, but also this kind of prefabricated homes that can be easily moved with their entire structure from one place to another. That was Sandra's house. This mobile home park was bordered by a wall that separated it from the highway, and the entrance was guarded by a manager. In theory, not just anyone could enter, which apparently made it a safe place to live. Let's say that's the first thing one thinks when they see a neighborhood with security at the door. I'm not going to get into statistics, but it's not always like that. We are talking anyway about a community made up of about 100 people where everyone knew each other. That is, usually the children could go out, run, and play freely in the streets because it was not very likely that they would leave the park. This worked out wonderfully for Sandra because she was an extremely outgoing girl. She loved making friends, so she spent many hours of fun playing with her neighborhood friends and even chatting with the adult neighbors in the area. Usually, every time she came home from school, she would make a kind of round on her way home where she would chat with the neighbors she found outside. She would tell them a little about her day, and then, happily, she would go to her home, greet her mother, and go out to play. A while before returning home, before dinner, to do some chores and spend time with her family. Sandra's aunt, Angie Chavez, describes her as a fun-loving girl, always full of energy. She loved to color, do gardening activities, and cook, especially baking her favorite cookies. She was also a super fan of Hannah Montana, and everyone around her knew it because she was always singing the songs from the television show. And even when she turned 8, her family organized a birthday party where she invited her friends from Melville S. Jacobson Elementary School, where she was in the 2nd grade. Above all, Sandra was more than happy. People around her appreciated her a lot, and she got many gifts that day. Of course, many of them with Hannah Montana prints, as can be seen in these photos. But not everything was rosy. In Sandra Maria's family life, her mother had many financial disputes with Daniel, the girl's father, who constantly refused to pass on the child support money that was rightfully his daughter's. However, Maria, with the help of her family, did everything possible to ensure that her little one lacked nothing and lived peacefully, surrounded by people who loved her. The truth is that Sandra's father left her life very early on, so this didn't interfere too much with her day-to-day life. She lived in a fairly stable way and had a routine that was already known by everyone in her house. So, as I mentioned a few moments ago, every day, when she got home from school, they let her leave the house, go out to play for a while, and come back in time for dinner. Until one day, suddenly, everything changed. It was March 27th, 2009, when Sandra, who had just turned 8 at the time, came home from school and did what she usually did. She greeted the neighbors, then came home, greeted her mother, and put her things away. And around 3 in the afternoon, she left the house to go play with a friend for a while, and then she would return as usual. But the hours passed, night fell, and Sandra didn't come home. So, it being approximately 7:30 in the evening, Maria, really worried, started calling the parents of her daughter's friends to see if any of them had seen her. All the responses were negative. It had been a while since anyone had seen Sandra, so she immediately went out in search of her. Her efforts yielded no results. Sandra was nowhere to be found, and Maria quickly realized that something was wrong. So, having passed 8 o'clock in the evening, she headed back to her home and called the Tracy Police Department, who quickly arrived at the scene. Here's something important that should always be kept in mind in these types of cases. And that is, the first few hours of disappearance are crucial for finding the missing person alive. The police knew they were against the clock, so they immediately interviewed Maria to get all the information that could give them a clue where to start looking, in addition to details of the clothes the girl was wearing that day. No neighbor in the area had any idea what could have happened to her, so there was nothing specific where to start other than the protocol that the police have when that happens, until they realized that there was a very important element that could have captured more details. There was a security camera at the entrance of Sandra's house. The girl's grandfather had placed a security camera a while ago to be able to detect any vandalistic act that could happen to them. For example, some teenager doing graffiti, someone breaking into the garden, cutting the flowers, someone trying to break into the house, anything. So they decided to review the images, and indeed, Sandra appeared in the video. It was 4 in the afternoon, and you could see the little girl heading home with a pink Hello Kitty t-shirt and black leggings, jumping around calmly, as usual. And when she was about to reach the entrance stairs, she turned to her right and walked out of the scene. This clip lasts 15 seconds, and it's the last time Sandra is seen about to reach her home. Janet Thiessen, the head of the Tracy Police Department, says that even though it's only 15 seconds, it's the proof they need to know that she was about to return home. But something caught her attention, changed her course, and from there, she disappeared. So this was the starting point to begin the investigation. The first thing they did was to investigate Sandra's closest circle. She had a good relationship with her siblings and grandparents with whom she lived. So, in reality, they were never considered as suspects or persons of interest for this case. But it was not the same with her father. Daniel Cantu, who at that precise moment was in a legal dispute with Maria over the payment of the girl's alimony. In fact, the man didn't even have a relationship with his daughter because he didn't even call her, let alone visit her. So the police began to suspect that perhaps he was the one who took Sandra with the intention of getting her out of the way. But it didn't take long to prove that Daniel Cantu was not in Tracy when the little girl disappeared. So he was no longer considered a person of interest in the case. As hours passed, police triangulated the area and began search operations. Brigades of volunteers were quickly assembled to help with the operations, but no one could find even a trace that could provide a clue as to what could have happened to Sandra. There were no more security cameras in the neighborhood, and Maria, along with her family, was devastated because it was almost dawn and she wondered if her daughter had eaten or drunk anything, or perhaps if she had found a shelter where she could protect herself from the cold. March 28 dawned, and by then a massive search had already been deployed. There was a helicopter in the whole area searching, with heat sensors inside and outside the housing unit. They asked house by house and tracked local businesses, but found nothing. The police were really shocked because it seemed like Sandra had evaporated into thin air and no one was giving them any clues that could be taken into account to find a direction in the investigation. So they issued a missing person bulletin that quickly alerted the Child Abduction Rapid Deployment, which stands for Child Abduction Rapid Deployment, a specialized area of the Federal Bureau of Investigation led at that time by Special Agent Joseph Bryan, who moved to Tracy with his entire team to take over the investigation. Time was passing, and everyone in the police knew that every second that passed was one less probability that Sandra was alive. The first thing the Federal Bureau of Investigation did when they took over the investigation was to interrogate absolutely all the residents of the private mobile home park where Sandra lived. And far from detecting a single suspect, the task became even more complicated. When they realized that Sandra was extremely popular in the area, everyone knew her, and perhaps Sandra had been in every neighbor's house at least once in her life, because she was an extremely sociable and friendly girl. Not only did she like talking to children her own age, but she also enjoyed talking to adults and always offered to help them with some household tasks. This, coupled with the fact that all the children played freely outside their homes, now made everyone, all the neighbors, suspects. The next step was to identify people who had been involved in this type of crime or who had criminal records and lived in the same condominium. Mainly males between 25 to 40 years of age who had contact with Sandra at least in the last few years, as it was very likely that the person responsible for her disappearance knew her. Now, it's important to note that this is a hypothetical profile based on statistics compiled by Federal Bureau of Investigation profilers. We're talking about a case where there is no crime scene. So creating a very detailed profile, or perhaps closer to reality, is much more complicated. Anyway, we had to start somewhere while all this was happening. Maria receives a text message from one of her neighbors, the mother of a friend of her daughter, where she said, "Tell the police that I found something around 4 in the afternoon. I don't know if it makes a difference or not, but one of the suitcases that was at the entrance of my house was stolen." The police noted the event, but there were also no images showing someone taking the suitcase or any other details, so they had to move on. Now, something that greatly concerned the investigators was that the neighborhood bordered Highway 205, which connects the city of Tracy with the bay. This means that if someone from outside entered the place in a vehicle and took Sandra from the mobile home park, they would have immediately escaped via this route that leads to the bay, which would make it almost impossible to catch them or have any clues about it. The police were worried, and it seemed like things were getting more and more complicated. By this point, an office had already been set up solely dedicated to the search for Sandra, and there were approximately 200 people looking for the girl. Her picture was already being broadcast on media outlets, and the search had extended to the entire city. But they still couldn't find any kind of clue until the search team that was at the city dump found what appeared to be the pink shirt that little Sandra was wearing the day of her disappearance. With much regret, the police had to show it to the family, but fortunately it was a much larger size than Sandra's. In the midst of so much chaos and desperation, there was a sigh of relief, and the hope of finding the girl alive resurfaced. It was time to review the filter that the police had to apply to Sandra's neighbors in order to discard and only keep the suspects who met the hypothetical profile that had been proposed. The results were absolutely chilling. There was a considerable number of people with criminal records in the neighborhood, people on parole, and what was even more worrying, a long list of registered sex offenders. That is, there could be in the neighborhood, with all this that I'm telling you, other unregistered sex offenders. Now, an investigation began on these suspects regarding how close they were to Sandra, and alarms quickly went off when they discovered an event that had occurred 2 years prior to the date of the disappearance. And it was that one summer, while at the local pool, when Sandra was 6 years old, a man approached the little girl. He brushed a strand of hair away from her face that was covering it, and without any hesitation, he kissed Sandra on the lips. While they were there at the pool, apparently Sandra's mother was not present when this happened, but the rest of her family was, who, according to Angie Chavez, the girl's maternal aunt, were worried. But they let this incident pass because the man said he had done it as a sign of affection, without any malice. I'll break his face. I'm gonna leave this in the video. I would break his face. It didn't escalate at that moment, but clearly given the circumstances, the police set their sights on this individual. When they proceeded to interrogate him, he immediately acknowledged what had happened in this pool and reiterated that he had not done it with bad intentions. This man had no kind of background, but nevertheless, he made a disturbing confession to the case investigators. He had intimate fantasies with minors. Now he had become the main suspect in the case, the main person of interest, but this was just the beginning. Suddenly, the administrator of the neighboring unit remembered a strange event that occurred on the same day of Sandra's disappearance. An ice cream truck, one of those typical ones you see in the United States, with the music that attracts the attention of children. It was parked very close to Sandra's house, and the man who was driving it was talking to all the children who approached. This ice cream man had never entered the park before. So the manager found this highly suspicious and confronted him, asking him to leave the place, and without further ado, he left. The police wondered if this had anything to do with Sandra's disappearance. It wasn't clear, but they had to rule out all possibilities. The police were acting as quickly as they could. However, there were no precise evidence or clues as to where Sandra was. It was the night of March 28, 2009, and a whole day had passed without any news of the little girl. So all the people in the community who were also worried about the young girl gathered in the middle of the mobile home park to show their support for the family through a vigil where they arrived with candles and hundreds of stuffed animals to show their affection. Hopes were fading, and as that was happening, the police were present, continuing their investigations. When suddenly the scream of a totally frantic woman broke the silence of the night, saying, "I found something, I found something." Immediately, a couple of agents approached her and accompanied her to the area where the mailboxes of the housing complex were located. And there, she pointed out on the floor what appeared to be a handwritten note, where it could be read, "Cantu locked in a suitcase thrown into the water." At Baqueti Road and Whitehall Road, witness. Now, the investigators had a clue. And whether it was real or fake, as often happens in some cases, it had something to do with it anyway. So, immediately, the experts began to analyze the note, which for starters was written with deliberate spelling mistakes. That is, it was poorly written. On purpose, probably to be able to camouflage the true handwriting of whoever wrote it. There were many doubts. Why would a note appear in the middle of a vigil? Was someone trying to divert their attention? It could be, but the police couldn't afford to overlook this information because in reality they only had conjectures and assumptions. There was nothing concrete that could give them clues about Sandra's whereabouts. So, as soon as dawn broke, a search team was sent to the area indicated on the paper. When they arrived, they found themselves in an area of dairy farms surrounded by a series of sedimentation ponds for the runoff of cattle manure. In other words, wastewater, so searching in them became very complicated. However, they did it without any success. So, was the message a hoax? There was no choice but to turn to the person who found it for more details. Her name was Melissa Huckabee, who at the time of the events was 28 years old and was the mother of Sandra's best friend, a 5-year-old girl who lived next door. The girls always played together after school, and the truth is that both families were very close. Melissa was a Sunday school teacher, as her grandfather, Clifford Lawless, was the pastor of the Baptist church, Clover Road, which was very close to the mobile home park where they lived. When the police went to look for her again at the housing unit, it turns out she was the same woman who had reported that a suitcase she had left in her driveway had been stolen. So the police were convinced that she probably had noticed something or had some information that could be helpful in finding Sandra. When they began to interview her, Melissa mentioned that when she read the note she found near the mailboxes on the night of the vigil, she was alarmed. Because the paper said that Sandra was in a suitcase and that the suitcase that had just been stolen was big enough for a child to fit inside it. These statements, plus the fact that she herself had become involved in the case and was so active in it, added to the fact that her story was becoming less believable, it began to worry the investigators, who immediately turned their attention to her. But Melissa had an alibi. At the time Sandra disappeared, she was alone in her grandfather's church, decorating the room where she taught Sunday school. They even obtained the woman's phone records and verified that she was nearby. At the time of the events, she made a call from the church to the administrator of the condominium where they lived. With all this information, the agents decided to first search Melissa's car. And here they found something curious. A paper note with blue ink where there were 3 different scribbles. When the experts analyzed the strokes, under these scribbles there were actually 3 hidden phrases. Buckety Road, Whitehall Road, and Water, the same address that was on the note left by the supposed witness of the case. So, was it she herself who had written the note? What else did she know about the disappearance of Sandra Cantu? The police had many questions to answer, so they decided to search her house. Inside her room, in the drawer of the nightstand, they found a notebook missing a page. When they had it analyzed, they discovered that the note found on the night of the vigil corresponded to that notebook. And even they were able to compare some letters written in it with those of the note. And indeed, Melissa Huckabee had written it and had made everyone believe that she found it. At this stage, the police contemplated 2 possibilities. One was that Melissa possibly desired her brief moment in the spotlight. You know, like those typical people who make everything about themselves. And believe it or not, it often happens in these types of cases. People who hinder the investigation simply because they want attention. The other possibility is that he was hiding something much darker, directly related to the disappearance of Sandra Cantu. So they start questioning her, but far from refusing to answer the questions, Melissa is very cooperative and provides valuable information about a neighborhood individual who at some point had been involved with a previous case where they basically drugged a 7-year-old child. And he helped his mother by taking him to the hospital. Then he disappeared just as the police arrived. That case did not escalate, but this time the police decided to make sure, bringing a dog specialized in sniffing out corpses to his home, which gave a positive result in this man's vehicle. But when the forensic scientists did the corresponding tests, they didn't find any human remains. Little by little, more and more alarming things were appearing. For example, the neighbors of the block of houses informed the police about a young man who lived with his stepfather in a mobile home, who was always seen with Sandra. When they entered his home to investigate, they themselves showed the police some pictures they had of Sandra. Some of them only of her legs or Sandra sitting in their laps. At the same time, they found questionable images of children on his computer and a teddy bear they used for self-gratification. However, none of the men had criminal records, so they were simply added to the list of persons of interest. Hours, minutes passed, and the police had no certainty, so what they decided to do was start to narrow down their list of suspects. To do this, they subjected each of the people on the list to a polygraph test to see if they could find any inconsistencies. Remember that the polygraph test is not really about whether you lie or tell the truth, but it can give agents an idea of how you behave under pressure, among other things. One by one, they were debating the results until a call to the city sheriff completely changed the course of the investigation. 3 kilometers from the trailer park where Sandra lived, workers at a dairy farm noticed a suitcase floating on the wastewater, which had recently reduced its level. Soon, the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the investigation team arrived at the area. They found it, pulled the suitcase out of the water, and by its weight, there was definitely something inside. The first thing they could notice is that the zippers were secured with some white ropes. They transported the suitcase to the offices of the San Joaquin County coroner, and upon opening it, they discovered the lifeless body of a little girl in a fetal position. The dental records and the clothes she was wearing confirmed what the investigators didn't want to hear. Sandra Cantu was found 11 days after her disappearance. And now the only thing left to do was to try to find out who was responsible for this event and get justice. For Sandra and her family, the little girl was dressed in the same clothes she was wearing the day she disappeared. And the toxicology tests revealed that she had been given benzodiazepines. There were no visible signs of violence, so the conclusion was that Sandra was sedated and then suffocated before being put in the suitcase. But there was something that no one expected. Upon further analysis, it was determined that Sandra had been sexually assaulted with an object and then her attacker had cleaned her body. This is usually a sign of remorse and often indicates that the person responsible for the crime was close to the victim. Other times, it can simply mean that the person knows what they are doing. Sandra's family was informed of the findings. It was an extremely hard moment because her mother still held out hope of finding her little daughter alive, but unfortunately, that was not the case. Sandra had been murdered, and the police were trying to work to find the culprit. And given the circumstances now, Melissa Huckabee, the neighbor who had reported her suitcase stolen, and she had written and found the note that gave the exact location where Sandra's body was later found, she had become the main person. Interest in this event? The next step for the police was to go look for Melissa Huckabee at her home with the intention of giving her a polygraph test. But when the investigators arrived at her house, it turns out they couldn't find her, because Melissa had been rushed to the hospital as she had tried to take her own life by swallowing razor blades. The police were baffled. Was she the guilty one and had been found out, or was she still trying to draw attention? With Melissa admitted, what the police did was start to question her family and find some very interesting information. Melissa had a troubled past, and not only that, but she even had a criminal record. 3 months ago, before the death, Melissa had been charged with petty theft in a department store. But of course, that may have nothing to do with what happened to Sandra. However, as they delved deeper into her life, her background became much more serious. 2 years ago, when they lived in the city of La Palma in California, their house suffered 2 arson fires. And Melissa was identified as a person of interest in the case, although no charges were ever filed. Another thing investigators discovered about Melissa was that she was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, anxiety, and depression. So she was taking various medications as part of her treatment, and it was logical that she would have them in her house. The thing is, 3 months ago, just when she was charged with petty theft, which I mentioned a few moments ago, Melissa was also accused by a neighbor of taking her daughter to a nearby park without her permission and when she brought her back home. The girl was behaving extremely strangely. She was slurring her words, had no strength in her muscles, was very drowsy, and was practically dragging herself. So the woman and her boyfriend took the girl to the emergency area of the hospital. And the tests revealed that the girl had benzodiazepines in her bloodstream. Melissa obviously denied everything, and no charges were brought against her. Precisely for that reason, the police had to be completely sure before bringing any charges against her. But while they continued investigating, a local Marine was interviewed along with other people who lived near the area where Sandra's body was found. He stated that on the day of the incident, he was leaving with his wife to have dinner in his car, when suddenly they saw a vehicle pulled over on the road with the door open, so they decided to park to make sure everything was okay. When he got out of the car, the man ran into Melissa Huckabee, who was emerging from a ditch. The man perfectly described Melissa and her vehicle. He said they exchanged a brief conversation about where he was going to have dinner with his wife, and then he left. The time matched the timeline when the crime was committed. All the evidence pointed to Huckabee, but unfortunately, it was all circumstantial. What the police needed was irrefutable physical evidence. So they obtained a warrant to search Melissa's grandfather's church, where she taught Sunday school. The investigation team's mission was clear. They wanted to find something directly related to the discovery of Sandra's body. In this case, some piece of rope that matched the one found in the suitcase and that was used to secure the zipper. And so it was. When they entered the room where Melissa was giving Sunday school classes, they found that the blind cord covering the window had been cut, and someone had tied the remainder to disguise it. But in addition, the team was also looking for the object with which Sandra was sexually assaulted, so they searched the entire church with luminol to try to find traces of bodily fluids. And it turns out that in the kitchen, they found a dented rolling pin that had a red stain, which was obviously taken as evidence to be analyzed. 5 days passed during this time. Melissa was discharged from the hospital, and the police realized that her daughter, along with her grandparents, had left the house and had left the city. They had to act quickly before Melissa slipped through their fingers. So, being April 10th of 2009, they intercepted her phone to listen to her communications and managed to realize that she was planning something terrible. Melissa called Sandra Cantu's house to ask Maria, Sandra's mother, to send her other daughter to her house to play with her little one. Everything seemed to indicate that Melissa thought she had gotten away with it and wanted to act again. But the police and the Federal Bureau of Investigation took action to prevent her from claiming another victim. They immediately sent Detective Bauer to Melissa Huckabee's house, and fortunately, Sandra's sister had not yet arrived. The agent made Melissa believe that they were taking the neighbor's statements again and convinced her to accompany him to the police station for a round of questions. All very casually, but what they really wanted was for Melissa Huckabee to confess the crime she committed with her own voice. Now the police had enough evidence to prove that Melissa Huckabee was the only one responsible for the death of Sandra Cantu. When they took her to the interrogation room, Detective Bauer began to confront her. First, showing her that they knew she had written the note, and that meant she knew where Sandra's remains were. Melissa kept denying it, and 5 hours of interrogation later, the detective tells her that 2 people saw her coming out of the ditch on Whitehall Road between 5:30 and 5:40 in the afternoon on the day of the events, and then Huckabee starts to cry. She points out that she told those people she was okay and that she had only stopped because she needed to go to the bathroom. But when Detective Bauer asks her what she was doing at that moment, she completely breaks down and only responds that it was an accident. So it was official. Melissa Huckabee had just confessed that she ended Sandra Cantu's life, but indicated that it was accidental. Her version said that she was playing hide and seek with Sandra and her daughter, that some time had passed. She got distracted doing other activities and forgot they were playing. Then she left the house, took the suitcase she was going to take to her grandfather's church, arrived at the place, took out this suitcase. She started to decorate her living room, and when she opened it, she realized that Sandra was inside, pale and motionless. Melissa tried to wake her up, but it was already too late. Supposedly, Sandra got into the suitcase to hide, and she didn't know it. She tried to perform cardiopulmonary resuscitation, but nothing seemed to work, so she put her back in the suitcase and decided to dispose of the body in the pond, because she didn't want anyone to think that she killed her. By this time, the forensic test results had arrived, indicating that the metal roller found in the church kitchen contained traces of Sandra's DNA, and that the rope used to tie the suitcases belonged to Melissa Huckabee's living room blind. At the same time, when the police searched Melissa's computers, they found an article about a similar incident where a grandfather had ended his grandson's life, put him in a suitcase, and thrown him into the river. Everything seemed to indicate that the crime against Sandra Cantu had been premeditated. It all starts with the clip from the security camera at Sandra's house, which only lasts a few seconds but now makes sense. At the beginning of the investigation, specialists indicated that it seemed something had caught Sandra's attention. A second before stepping foot at the entrance of her house, only to then change her course and exit the frame. Precisely, it was Melissa Huckabee calling her. This seemed to indicate that Melissa proposed to Sandra to accompany her in her car to decorate her church hall. It seems that the little one got into the car voluntarily, and 8 minutes after Sandra was last seen. On the surveillance tape, you can see Melissa's car passing by. Once there, Sandra ingested a drink with benzodiazepines that Melissa prepared for her, and once unconscious, she was attacked with a rolling pin. Around 5 in the afternoon. The phone record indicates that Melissa made a call to the housing park manager, reporting that someone had stolen a suitcase she had left at her entrance. Clearly, this was to have some sort of alibi. Minutes before 6 in the evening, both witnesses, the local Marine and his wife, saw Melissa coming out of the ditch after having left the suitcase with Sandra's remains in the pond. That means that, unfortunately, Sandra Cantu was already deceased when her mother called 911 to report her disappearance. Everything happened extremely fast. Despite all the evidence against her, Melissa Huckabee kept insisting it was an accident. And it wasn't until May 10, 2010 that this woman decided to accept a deal in which she pleads guilty to the charges of kidnapping and murder of Sandra Cantu. In exchange for the other charges, which include abuse and substance supply, substances that would be annulled. That's how she was spared the death penalty and was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole. Every time Melissa Huckabee is asked why she did it, an answer is never obtained. But authorities believe she could have ended Sandra's life out of jealousy. As absurd as this sounds, jealousy that he was stealing the affection of her own daughter. There was something that perhaps makes much more sense, a need for recognition. By getting so involved in the crime that she herself committed, like trying to help the police talk to Sandra's mother, creating false clues and that kind of stuff. Maybe she thought that no one would discover her and that she would rather be recognized as the person who helped find Sandra's remains and would be considered a kind of local heroine. But in the end, none of that happened. She earned the total contempt of her community. And today she still says, "I still can't understand why I did what I did." This is a question I will struggle with for the rest of my life. So this is where we end with the case of Sandra Cantu. Tell me what you think down in the comments. And did you know this story? I remind you that you can recommend cases for me to cover on the channel in my email, which is down there in the description of all the videos. So here are the patrons and the channel members. Thank you for supporting me through those platforms. And without anything else to say, here is a new video. Here is a recommended video. You can subscribe by clicking on my face and see you in another video.